Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday study. Snowy day out there today. Pray that you are safe as you travel home, and thanks again for taking the time to listen. We are going through the book of Daniel in chapter 5, and last week was a very interesting study on the handwriting on the wall, as we have used that cliche many times in English. And that was a story where the king transgressed God by taking the um, special goblets and cups that were dedicated to the temple and using them in a very dedicated way, if you will, in his party. And so the hand appeared and wrote something on the wall. And of course, the king was really freaked out by this. And so that's where our story picks up today in verse 7. And the king, of course, cried out to bring out his team, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, and we've gone through the meanings of these groups of people. What's interesting is that we're going to find here that this is actually the son of King Nebuchadnezzar, and a lot of time has passed since King Nebuchadnezzar had his episode and had his encounter and had relied upon his uh, enchanters and astrologers and so forth. And it seems like this is just a repetition of another king later in time doing all the same things all over again. And so, with that thought, we continue. So, again, the king makes a proclamation to whoever shall read this writing and declare the interpretation thereof shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold about his neck and shall rule as one of the three in the kingdom. I want to look up that word purple. And to do that, we'll go to our Bible Hub. And even though this is in Aramaic, it still gives the meanings of that. And so, whether it's Aramaic or whether it's Hebrew or even in the New Testament, whether it's Greek, you can still gain a lot of insight by using Bible Hub and going to the interlinear layout, clicking on the number above. And here we see this word for purple. It's number 711. We open it up and it talks about where the word is derived from, and it's not a root that's used in the Hebrew Bible. That's kind of interesting. Of course, we are, you know, in using Aramaic, so it would only show up in Daniel and Ezra, which are Aramaic entries in the Hebrew Bible, the largest ones. It talks about a Greek equivalent. This is something new that Bible Hub has added, which allows us to make those cross references to anything in the New Testament. And it gives a reference here to Mark 15, verse 17, where Jesus was clothed in a purple robe. And again, that's kind of the reason I chose to look at the word purple, because it's often associated with royalty. But yet we know that they didn't have all of the colors and the dyes to create them like we do today. And so I thought it was useful to just see, we'd heard stories, or at least I have, of where the color purple comes from. And again, here they give a nice historical background that it comes from a certain mollusk of the sea. And obviously, it takes a lot of, from what I understand, they're very tiny. And when you crush them, it the color of their remains comes out purple, and it's used to dye fabrics, but it was very expensive and so mainly associated with royalty. I thought that was kind of interesting. Looking at the right side of the screen here, it tells us where this word is used. It's really only used three times in Daniel, so that's kind of interesting. We'll watch for that as it comes up again. And so you're clothed with purple. You're going to have a chain around your neck and be third in the kingdom. That is a little interesting because he was the king. So how would he become one of three? We're going to find out as we scroll down here to the commentator. Jewish commentator says that this kingdom was kind of a shared kingdom, that the king was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but it was also shared somewhat with Darius, and we're going to see that name come up later. after this story progresses. And so Daniel would become one of the three. So that's kind of interesting. Um, and but the king brought in his wise men in verse 8. They could not read the writing. Sounds familiar. Same thing his dad went through with the writing. So it lets you know that this was orchestrated by God, created in a way that these men who were the wisest in the nation um, could not interpret it. Now, again, we know that this is an Aramaic, and there's Hebrew is also a biblical language. And so, there are some commentators will say, well, maybe this was in Hebrew, maybe Aramaic was, passing out of usage and, all of those things. But these were the wisest people on the earth, and they could not interpret this. So we have to believe that this is something that God created specifically for this episode to make his power known and to make it so that they would have to solve this in a way that wasn't relying on their own background, their own resources. So the king was greatly affrighted, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were perplexed. I love some of the beauty of this language. That his countenance was changed. And how can you not just want to stop and look that up? And so we go back to Bible Hub and we look at these words here. And the word for countenance relates to number 2122. So we unpack this. The Aramaic word, root word is ziv, which is interesting. And here it talks about the word of being brightness, of being ability to shine. We relate that to someone's face shining basically when they're happy. So you get the idea that the king maybe was a pretty jolly guy the whole time, and he was always pretty happy, and that being sad and being upset, being downcast was not something that you were used to seeing in the king. They also here go through and talk about this concept of Ziv would have been understood as a manifestation of God's glory or an honor bestowed upon a king or a sacred place. So this is a term that appears to be used for someone who has a higher status, and whether that status is given to him as a authoritarian position or whether it was a position that was given by God, there seems to be a special word for this presence, if you will, of this person who is in this exalted status. And I think that's kind of neat because you'll see many times in the Bible that there'll be terms associated, words associated with God's children, God's anointed, when they are anointed by God, when they are being used in a special way by God, that there'll be something about their countenance. And that's certainly something in the Christian tradition that we want to emulate, that we want God's presence to be upon us. There's a song that I really love. It says, let them see you in me, talking about this person singing about having God's presence within them, and that when others would see him, let them see you in me, let them hear you when I speak, let them feel you when I sing, let them see you in me. And so it's something very precious to me that I certainly endeavor and to have in my life. So they noticed that about the king, that something was different about him. His countenance was changed, his attendants were perplexed because of it. And then something comes, mom comes to the rescue. So we see in verse 10 that the king, or excuse me, the queen heard about the words of the king and came into the banquet house. We know from the book of Esther that the uh, queen, as associated with the king, his wife or his concubine, could not just come running into the presence of the king. But here, this is thought to be his mom, the queen mother, if you will, Nebuchadnezzar's widow. And so she was on a level all by herself. She was the mother of the king, and she obviously had special rights and privileges because she just comes into the banquet house. Notice she wasn't there before, so she wasn't part of his revelry or drunken brawl with the boys. And so she comes in and says, "Oh, King, live forever." Typical entry there. Let not your thoughts affright you. Don't let your countenance be changed. And she says, "Remember, there's a man in the kingdom," and she's talking about Daniel, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Kind of interesting. It's very much similar terminology to what Nebuchadnezzar used in the previous chapter. And she reminded him that when your dad had the same problem, your father, the king, he called Daniel in. Daniel took care of things, and Nebuchadnezzar made him master of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and so forth. So obviously, time has passed, and this new king did not remember Daniel. Daniel was kind of cast off. Let's see what the sages say about this time frame here. It talks about the time had passed after Nebuchadnezzar's death. Daniel was forgotten. But look at the amount of time that they say has passed, that Daniel was currently at this time an old man, about 80 years of age. When I read this, I just had to stop and think a little bit because the setting we were under, Daniel was exalted by the previous king. He enjoyed a place of prominence, but now a lot of time has passed, perhaps 30, even 40 years since the last time we've heard of Daniel. And you have to beg to ask the question, what was Daniel doing all this time? What happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Did they pass away? And what was Daniel doing? What kind of shape was he in? Did he have any position? Obviously, he's still alive. He's still seemingly doing well, had settled into Babylon. But yet, did he think that, perhaps God forgot about him? Wouldn't it be normal to think, okay, his ministry's over, it was used for this time, he's kind of put out to pasture, if you will, and, he's going to just pass into oblivion. But we see here that God has other plans, and how it must have felt for Daniel to suddenly be summoned again. And did he know what was happening? And then also to Daniel's credit of him, we trust being able to keep faithful to God, to maintain his devotion to God. How did they get together? Did they have their own little synagogue in Babylon? How did they keep the festivals? How did they read, the Torah? How did they keep their faith kindled and supported? Well, was there a thriving Jewish community in Babylon that all held to, their faith? Um, all wonderful questions that we don't have answers for, but we know that Daniel was faithful, that Daniel, in the midst of this pagan land, this pagan culture, the pressures that he must have felt being in the position in the government and then being maybe pushed out of his position, maintaining his integrity, maintaining his walk with God through all this time, I think was just really something that I wish we knew more about. But Daniel did it. And so it- they note that he was brought to them, and she says that he has an extraordinary spirit, or as the sages say, a surpassing spirit. Well, we have to look that one up too. That's a really interesting word because how did Daniel maintain that? Um, Again, we struggle to keep our walk with God, and we, try to go to church every week. We try to read our Bible every day. And yet here was a man totally displaced from his comfort zone and where he wanted to be. But here in the Aramaic, in the Bible Hub, it says that he had an excellent spirit. The word ruach is spirit. And we open up this word excellent. And see what it has to say. It says that it's an excellent, surpassing, preeminent. A lot of superlatives here about how great this is. The usage is that he had a quality or virtue that surpassed everybody else. This tells me that Daniel was walking the walk and living the life in a way that people still respected him, that how he conducted himself was still leaving a mark, still leaving a witness there. And so as we continue, um, she's speaking very high praises of Daniel. He had a surpassing spirit. And then it says that it was interpreting riddles, dreams, and then the loosening of knots. Wow. What is that all about? Got to take a look at that. That's pretty fun. So, in Bible Hub, it talks about these words and maybe a little different understanding. It says dreams, solution of riddles, explaining of enigmas, and we're found in Daniel. So let's take a look at this word riddle here, which is number 280. And as it comes up, it says these are dark sayings, enigmas. Not a word I use often, but they are talking about things that are not clearly seen. Makes a reference to 1 Corinthians 13 and 12, where Paul talks about seeing through a glass darkly. I love how these parallels are coming up, where Paul is using similar terminology to what he knew from his Hebrew and Jewish background. And so the whole idea of serving God has many riddles, many things that are not clearly seen. And of course, that's why we're studying. That's why we do what we do. And let's unpack this word unravel. Well, that kind of is a play on words there, unpack or unravel, the word unravel. And it talks about being made smooth or to lead. And now we're going to see the term of loosening a knot, uh, a rope that's all bunched up with knots, and removing those knots and creating a nice smooth rope. And so these two words are tied together that give support to that. So as we look back and unpack the word enigma, it comes from the word qatar, which is derived from a knot, a riddle tied in with a vertebrae, which is kind of like a knot in your back. And so we get this very interesting cultural background here on what she is talking about of untying knots and explaining riddles. And so she calls for him, says, go get Daniel. And the king finds Daniel and brings him in. And verse 13 says, that you're Daniel, are you who you say you are? You're of the children of Israel. And I've heard about you, that the understanding of God is within you, and that you can interpret these dreams. You can loose the knots of understanding. You can read the writing and make known this interpretation. And if you do this, you're going to be showered with wealth, chain of gold, clothed in purple. You'll rule as one of the three. And I love how Daniel speaks to him and replies, and this is where we're going to end our study today. And he says, King, I don't want any of it. Let your gifts be to yourself. Give your rewards to someone else. I don't want anything you want to give me, but I will make the writing known unto the king, and I will provide unto you the interpretation. Um, Something we have to notice here is that there's no word of, oh, I got to go pray about this. Let me come back tomorrow. I'm caught totally by surprise as what you are talking about here. Let me go see if God's going to give me an interpretation. Daniel comes in prepared. He comes in ready to go. We can only assume from this is that Daniel knew what was happening all along and that his relationship with God allowed him to be prepared on the spot. And I think this is a wonderful thing because it gives us maybe somewhat of a challenge, maybe somewhat of an idea of in our life, we may not always have time to go and think about it or wait and say, oh, I'm going to pray and ask for God's direction, which are all very wonderful and valid things. And if that presents itself as being such and we don't know what to do, That's obviously what we should be doing, but to also maybe live our life as Daniel did, because you never know what tomorrow may bring. You never know what the next hour may bring, but to live your life in such a relationship with God that no matter what happens, next time the telephone rings, you will be prepared and that you will know that God has you in a place and that you are in a place with God to be ready for the next challenge, to be ready for the next situation of whatever life brings your way. And so, with that, we're going to stop after verse 17. I pray that this study will be a blessing unto you. And thanks again for listening, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye bye.